Welcome to the AI Energy and Climate Podcast, a special series from the DSR Network hosted by David Sandalow.
Hi, it's David Sandalow. Thanks for joining us. Today I'm in Houston at CERAWeek, one of the biggest energy conferences every year. And the hot topic here is AI and data centers. It's come up in almost every session I've been at, and there are many sessions that are devoted exclusively to that topic. And I recently had the chance to read a really good report on this topic by the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress. It's called Powering Artificial Intelligence, a study of AI's environmental footprint today and tomorrow. And I'm delighted to have two of the lead authors of that report here with us today. Dr. Bernhard Lorentz is the founding chair of the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress, and Dr. Johannes Truby is with the Deloitte Economics Institute. I'm going to welcome both of them and start by asking them each to say a brief word about their background. Starting with Bernhard.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, David. Thanks for having us. It's really a hot topic, not only at CERAWeek, but also during the negotiations for the incoming administration here in Berlin. And you heard that in Paris at the AI summit, the EU Commission also made major statements about the needed investments. I'm an energy guy over the last 20 years, probably in and out in several administrations in Germany. I did also work on this academically, but mainly was practicing advisory work for both governments and major players globally in this area. And I came through this basically by questions of clients in the energy field asking to better understand the connection, the really energy demand. And luckily, I have my dear colleague Johannes, who is one of the most gifted energy economists worldwide. And he did some wonderful modeling about this, Johannes, right?
Exactly, Bernhard. And I remember the moment when those topics first came up, and we started discussing, reflecting about how we could make sense of what we've been observing, what's been put out in the newspapers about this strong increase in energy demand through AI, from data centers. And we jointly thought about a real economic modeling approach to this, where we would look at the numbers and look at the data, really crunch the numbers and make sure we get some robust perspectives out there. That's really what's been at the core of my career. I'm responsible here at Deloitte for a service called Energy and Climate Economics that is very much about putting numbers onto energy market trends. Before joining Deloitte, I've been for several years with the International Energy Agency, mostly working on a book called The World Energy Outlook.
Well, let's get into your report, which, as I said earlier, is called Powering Artificial Intelligence, and we'll leave the link in the program notes. Johannes, you just want to start with what you all conclude on AI's current energy and environmental footprint.
Yeah. Look, David, as I said, we started crunching the numbers in the beginning. And one of the initial questions was, where are we standing today in terms of data center energy consumption? And we figured that data centers around the world today consume around 380 terawatt hours of electricity per year. And just to give you a feeling for what that number means, that's about the consumption of a country like Saudi Arabia. So it's not gigantic, but it's not negligible either. And obviously what is very important is how that electricity that the data centers use is generated. And if it's obviously mostly generated with renewables or low carbon sources, then the climate footprint is relatively low. But if we need to dispatch fossil fueled power stations to produce the electricity that will be used in data centers, then of course the environmental footprint gets worse. And so at this stage, what we found is that the energy consumption of data centers is around 0.4% of global CO2 emissions. So that's relatively small today. But obviously, with this gigantic growth that we're seeing, and with the prospects of AI really permeating our lives and our economic activities, the key question is, how is this going to evolve in the future?
So, and just to repeat that, so what you concluded is that of 0.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the power for data centers globally, and
That's right.
That's very consistent with the findings of a report that we did, the Artificial Intelligence for Climate Change Mitigation Roadmap, sponsored by NITO, that's also sponsoring this podcast. Our figure, we concluded less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and probably much less than 1%. So I found it very interesting to read your analysis. And just to be clear on the details there, that is what we'd call the scope 2 emissions, essentially, for data centers, the power coming to data centers. That doesn't include, for example, the upstream emissions from steel or cement that make the data centers. And it doesn't include the use of AI and what impacts the use of AI. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's exactly right.
Bernhard, anything to add on this front from your work on it?
No, I think it's super important to see always the broader picture you just referred to, David, not only the scope 2 as we speak, but also the usage, and looking about the usage and also the impact of AI on the broader climate development and the emissions is super important. We've done this in other studies, and you've done this, David, and I think it's worth looking at this with a full picture and a broad perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very difficult to come up with solid quantitative estimates at this point, and that's certainly one thing we found. Is that consistent with what you found as well in the broader area?
Johannes?
Yeah, look, I think we need to distinguish always why we do a certain analysis, and obviously, if you look at the different emission scopes. And you look at the entire world and you add up emissions, you need to make sure that you don't double count. So if we take the perspective of looking at the different sources for emissions, we obviously take for each sector a scope 2 perspective. If we were now to look at, let's say for a data center operator or something like that, to look at their carbon footprint, then obviously it would be very important to take the scope 1 and 3 emissions also into account. So it really depends which angle you're coming from in the analysis.
Well, so today, rough estimate, 380 terawatt hours of electricity and 0.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but that's going to grow, right? And so looking forward to, say, 2030, what did you find in your report?
Yeah, I think what is important if we make an outlook on data center energy consumption is that we distinguish a little bit between 2 phases. So sort of the short to medium term, the period out to 2030, and then the longer term out to 2050. And the reason for this is that in the short to medium term, we already have some good pointers as to what might be happening, because we know the construction pipeline, or at least part of the construction pipeline for data centers. And that means we have a relatively good estimate of where the journey might go. Now, if we look out to 2030, we find that data center electricity consumption might well reach almost 1,000 terawatt hours by 2030. And that's clearly a much bigger number than what we're seeing right now. But in the grand scheme of things, that would still remain around 3% of global electricity consumption by that date. So, obviously, when we did our outlook for AI and data centers, it's very important that we look at the different uncertainties in this market. And because I think this is very important to understand also for the listeners, I'd just like to quickly describe those primary uncertainties. The first uncertainty, obviously, is the pace and scale at which AI applications penetrate our lives and our economic activities. And that essentially determines the computing power needed to do this AI. The second major uncertainty is the potential for efficiency gains in data centers. And a good example is that data center electricity use has been growing rather moderately over the last couple of years, despite a more than 17-fold increase in internet traffic worldwide. So there is big scope for energy efficiency improvements, but how exactly they will pan out is a big uncertainty. And that essentially determines how much electricity you need for each computation. And then the third major uncertainty really is the availability and use of renewable and low carbon electricity to provide the electricity to the data centers. And that uncertainty, that determines at the end the carbon footprint of AI.
There's a lot to say about that, but one question, a term that has, I think, come into popular usage much more than it ever has, at least in the past couple of months, is Jevons paradox. I think a couple of months ago, at least in my circles, almost nobody knew the term Jevons paradox, but now it's become very widespread, at least in discussing this topic. And the idea, you're an economist, Johannes, you can explain it better than I can probably, but it's the rebound effect, and the idea is that as efficiency improves, people will use more and more of a product, and so I think there's some skepticism that the efficiency improvements in AI are going to lead to less use of or less demand for power. Is that something that you've looked at or thought about in the context of this report?
Yeah, and I think, David, your question reaches well into our longer term perspective. Because we have attempted to not only look at what is going to happen over the next couple of years, but really have made an attempt at understanding the long-term prospects of data center electricity consumption. And that means we're well into quite an uncertain territory. And that's why we decided to go for a scenario-based approach where we exactly look at those uncertainties that I have described previously. And sort of our higher bound scenario departs from the assumption that AI uptake will be relatively fast, very similar to what we've seen over the last couple of years, sort of continuation of that trend, but combined with a slowdown in energy efficiency improvements. And that would lead to electricity consumption of around 3,500 terawatt hours by 2050. Now, we have then, and that would be our sort of central scenario, used the same assumption on AI uptake, but assumed a continuation of the energy efficiency improvements that we've seen over the last decade. And the combination of these two trends would lead to electricity consumption of around 2,000 terawatt hours by 2050. And then we've had a third scenario, which functions a little bit as a lower bound, where we essentially acknowledge that we might well be in a bit of a hype cycle at the moment with AI. And that sort of the AI uptake might be slower than some expect. We also might see some rebound, and in that scenario, we'd end up at 1,700 terawatt hours in the long term. Now, what that means, David, is that there is a huge uncertainty range out in the future. But what it also means that if we put this sort of into the wider context, into the big picture, that no matter in which scenario you are, electricity consumption for data centers are only around 3 to 5% of total electricity consumption in 2050 in sort of a long-term outlook. And that really leads us to sort of one of what I find one of the most important conclusions and findings of our study is that what we're observing right now with AI, with data centers, the strong and rapid unanticipated increase in electricity demand is very much a harbinger of what we might be observing once all that electrification, that essentially all the net zero scenarios envisage, really kicks in. And that means data center electricity growth will be dwarfed by electrification of industry, by electrification of buildings and heat pumps and e-mobility, green hydrogen, and so on. And I think that's very important to bear in mind.
I think it's a very interesting conclusion. And I mean, just to restate it, you say, although there's uncertainty, 3 to 5% of global electricity demand roughly comes from data centers in the decades ahead in your forecasts or in your scenarios. Certainly more than 3 to 5% of the dialogue here at CERAWeek is around AI and data centers. So, and I think that's true in energy policy circles generally. So this topic is getting an enormous amount of attention, maybe more than the percentage of long-term electricity use.
Yeah, because we need to get it right this time. And I think this is it's just that we're observing now something that we will see more and more in the future. And the policy and the regulation, the way we deal with this problem is essentially a blueprint for how we will deal with electrification later on. And that's why it's so important to get it right now. And that's why all of this attention is really deserved for something that is actually not that huge.
That's such an important point. Bernhard, it looks like you had a comment.
Yeah, it reflects what Johannes just pointed out and what I call the electrification of everything, basically. We have come from the most mature industrial economy, the highest grade of integration, and the fastest transformation, right? So in this country at the moment, we are going for a climate neutrality goal by 45. And for this to become and to stay a leading industrial nation, we need to electrify directly whatever we can do. And this is what Johannes referred to. And as part of this discussion, for us, AI is a learning field, how to deal smartly from a policymaker's perspective with the high need of electricity in certain areas to certain times, right?
Well, to follow up on that, I think the country you're referring to is Germany. That's where you are right now. And could you say a word about the regulations and the policy framework for AI and data centers in Germany and then the EU more broadly?
Well, for data centers, there's not a lot of regulation. I mean, that's a myth, right? The question is if there's a willingness of the industry to invest in the right place. That's why Madame von der Leyen and Macron and now the new incoming German administration make those strong commitments for public sector investments in building this backbone of infrastructure, because we have a kind of, we are lagging behind in Europe, looking at the US in their investments in data centers and infrastructure. I think that's not the regulation you refer to. The regulation you refer to is the use of AI, where we have a new act in place by the EU as a proposal now, which is highly criticized, mainly by US social media and other internet companies, and that's highly, I think, debatable to say the least. If this is right to make a strong regulation of a technology use, where we very few things we have certain until now how this will be used. We have good experience in this country, and we are a little bit the Silicon Valley of regulation here in Europe, right? We have very good experience with looking at technologies and regulate them while they are developing. I always use the example of the railway, the first railway, the Eisenbahn, developed in Germany, and we started regulating it on the way we learned how to use this technology in the 19th century, right? And I think this is something that we have to discuss with our European partners when it's the right place and time, and to do how a kind of smart regulation of the use of AI. But that's not on data centers, right, Johannes?
Yeah, right. Right. I think if I look at regulation, I think that's also something that comes out of the observations of our study, is that it's very important that we start having an understanding of what is happening in data centers, and that we have transparent monitoring, that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about what is happening in data centers. That's sort of harmonized reporting standards, and then that we have sort of mandatory sustainability goals that incentivize those who build data centers to build them in the most efficient manner. And this is something that has happened in some jurisdictions. There are sort of mandatory targets related to sustainability in Germany, in France, in Austria, I think in China and Singapore, in Japan as well, as far as I know. But there is still a lot to be done and a lot to be gotten right in order to make sure that really this increase in electricity consumption from data center doesn't lead to an increase in emissions.
Well, good. Well, we're starting to get towards the end of our time. We haven't yet raised water, which is the topic that you discuss in your report, and look at the sustainability of water use in data centers. You want to say a word about that?
Yeah, I think that's something that is still a little bit overlooked. And as you point out, data centers are big consumers of water. To what degree that really is a problem depends primarily on location. Obviously, if you build data centers in places where there already is water scarcity, and I heard there are some challenges in California, maybe in Arizona and elsewhere, where you find data centers using water where there isn't much water. However, there's also loads of locations where data center water consumption isn't that much of a problem. What is quite interesting to see is that there is a bit of a trade-off between water consumption and energy consumption today, because the water is primarily used for cooling. And so if you do more water cooling, you do less venting and things like this, and that means you use less electricity. So that's a trade-off that we need to understand. Nevertheless, there is loads of innovation happening in terms of how to improve the cooling, in terms of how to improve the layout of data centers, of the stacks, to reduce sort of cooling needs, and therefore also reduce water consumption. And I think there have also been some good initiatives by tech companies to become water positive by 2030. That's very commendable. That's very good. But in general, David, maybe zooming a little bit out of the water perspective, one of the things that I'd really like to highlight is the importance of location when we look at data centers. Because at this stage, I think too little attention has been paid to where those data centers will be built. There was lots of incentives being given for them to be built in certain places without fully thinking it through where it would be best to put them. And I think if we now build more and more data centers, and according to our analysis, we will be building lots of data centers, we need to think very, very carefully where we put them. And some of the parameters that we really need to take into account is obviously the water, as just discussed, but is also to put them where we have a lot of excess renewables, because those data centers, they're big consumers of electricity, and they might help integrate renewables into the system. They might also act in terms of flexible demand, so reacting to shifts in prices, shifts in availability of renewables. And obviously, a third very important point for me from the energy perspective is that data centers, they produce a lot of heat, a lot of waste heat. But this waste heat might well be a very valuable resource to others. To heat apartments, to heat buildings for industrial processes even. And so co-locating data centers with heat users, thinking from the perspective of a regional energy hub is actually, for me, one of the best ways to design the future of data center location.
Thanks for that. Bernhard, any final points from your perspective, from your report or otherwise, before we close? Nope. Well, we are ending all of our podcast episodes asking our guests two questions, and the first question is, how are you using AI today? So I'll start with Bernhard on that. From a day-to-day basis, what are you doing with AI tools?
Well, we use it, I mean, as you can imagine, as a fully digitalized company, and I'm leading a global practice in this company every day and every hour. It starts with, doing primary research. We use it for many of the client needs in the fields of due diligences. Wherever you need data to be reduced to information, we use AI today. If we do make reports for clients, if we help them to deliver their own reports, that's something that I learned the hard way is now the only way to deliver in a way that you're competitive in the marketplace with all other actors outside there. So no big new deal that has not a huge part of AI in it.
Johannes, how about you?
Yeah, I can maybe complement Bernhard's global perspective from the perspective of a consulting infantryman. So we're using AI really in our daily work, and one good example is that I find AI super well suited for translations. And sometimes we work, I have sort of a global service, and I work in several countries in several languages. I have an international team. That means I deliver reports in several languages, and that also means I sometimes have colleagues working on projects that don't speak the client's language. And here, AI has proven extremely helpful in smoothing those language problems. And another thing is in the modeling that we're doing, coding is actually something that AI is very good at. So we can use AI to help us make the code more efficient and also just running faster. So that's something that we use quite a lot.
Terrific. And then final question, starting with Johannes. Could you please recommend 3 books, reports, or articles on any topic, old or new, classics from your childhood or an article you read yesterday?
Yeah, look, I will use this question quite shamelessly. A few other reports that we've done with the DCSP, which I believe are really, really worth a read. So for those who are really into hydrogen, I recommend to look at our green hydrogen report that we put out on the DCSP homepage, which maps the way the global hydrogen markets could emerge and details the different production technologies, the different costs, the cost evolutions. So I think that's sort of a super valuable piece of work. And then for those who are interested in how we can decarbonize aviation and maritime sectors, these are among the hardest to decarbonize sectors. We have another report out, the last mile to net zero, that looks at how we can produce synthetic fuels to decarbonize those sectors. And the third one is another DCSP study called Financing the Green Energy Transition, which looks at how we can mobilize all that money that is needed to produce green hydrogen, get the renewables that will power data centers, produce synthetic fuels for maritime and aviation, and so on. And of course, also make sure that the energy transition also happens in the global south.
And those reports, are they on the website of the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress?
Yes, they are. And I want to mention them too. If you ask me the same question, David, probably.
Yes, indeed, Bernhard. 3 books, reports, or articles. What do you recommend?
Well, Johannes has stolen one. I'm very proud of the hydrogen work that we have together done and really kind of laid out, I think, the new green hydrogen economy that we see occurring on the horizon. But I would like to add 2 books which really were fascinating for me reading the last 3 months. The first one just came out in November by my former colleague Todd Stern, the chief negotiator for the US at the climate agreement in Paris. Landing the Paris Agreement, really a super interesting but like a criminal story, how he described the process of landing the Paris Agreement, which is so important for all our conversations that we're having, particularly these days, I guess. The second one is from a good friend and colleague of mine, who's now serving in a think tank in California, Jeffrey Risman, who wrote Zero Carbon Industry, a book where he first made a full integrated approach and tried to explain how a net zero industry could look like in 2030, 2035 in parts of the OECD world. So 2 amendments to my friend's Johannes tips.
Well, Bernhard Lorentz, Johannes Truby, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for your great report, Powering Artificial Intelligence, and look forward to the next chance to connect.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, David.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.